On the evening of September 9th, 1943, Elise Beaumont stood in the dining room of a requisitioned mansion in Lyon, France, holding a silver tray with a bottle of expensive French wine that had been stolen from the previous owner's cellar. She was 27 years old, dressed in a plain black maid's uniform with a white apron, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. She was invisible. That's what SS Sturmbannführer Heinrich Vogel and the 3 other Nazi officers sitting at his dining table thought. They thought she was just a maid, just a French servant who cleaned their rooms, cooked their meals, poured their wine, and understood nothing of importance. They were wrong about all of it. Vogel was discussing military operations. Specifically, he was discussing a munitions train scheduled to depart Lyon in 72 hours, carrying artillery shells, ammunition, and explosives to German forces fighting on the Eastern Front. He was speaking in German, assuming, as he always did, that the French maid serving his dinner couldn't understand a word. The train departs at 0200 hours on the 13th, Vogel said, cutting into a stolen steak. 40 rail cars, fully loaded, 500 tons of munitions, enough to sustain operations for 3 weeks. One of the other officers, a captain, said, "Security?" Vogel waved his hand dismissively. "Minimal. 12 guards. The French resistance in this region is weak, disorganized. They gather intelligence, maybe, but they lack the capability for direct action. They're not a serious threat." Elise refilled Vogel's wine glass, her face blank, her movements practiced and subservient. Inside, her mind was racing. She was memorizing every word. Munitions train. September 13th. 0200 hours. 40 rail cars. 500 tons. Minimal security. She finished pouring the wine, stepped back against the wall, hands folded, eyes down, invisible. The officers continued talking, discussing routes, schedules, supply chains, completely unaware that every word they spoke was being recorded in the memory of the woman they dismissed as beneath notice. After dinner, Elise cleared the table, washed the dishes, and left the mansion at 9 o'clock, exactly as she did every night. She walked through the darkened streets of occupied Lyon, past German checkpoints where soldiers barely glanced at her papers because she was just a maid going home after work. She walked for 20 minutes, then slipped into a narrow alley, through a back door, and down a flight of stairs into the basement of a dress shop, for people were waiting for her. And Elise Beaumont, the invisible maid, became someone else entirely. Elise was born on April 15, 1916, in Strasbourg, a city in the Alsace region of France, right on the border with Germany. Her father, Henri Beaumont, was French, a literature teacher at the local lycée who believed in education, in culture, in the power of ideas. Her mother, Greta, was German, from Stuttgart, a translator who'd moved to Strasbourg for work and fallen in love with a French teacher who quoted Voltaire and Hugo. Elise grew up speaking both languages fluently, switching between French and German depending on which parent she was talking to. It was normal in Alsace, a region that had been passed back and forth between France and Germany for centuries, where the border was more of a suggestion than a barrier. She had a good childhood, books everywhere, 2 parents who loved her, a city that was beautiful and cultured and felt safe. She studied literature at the University of Strasbourg, wanted to be a teacher like her father, wanted to spend her life with books and ideas and students. Then, on June 14, 1940, German forces entered Paris. 8 days later, France surrendered. The Alsace region, including Strasbourg, was annexed directly into Germany. It wasn't just occupied. It was declared German territory. The French language was banned. French culture was suppressed. And anyone who resisted was dealt with harshly. Elise's father resisted. He refused to teach in German. He refused to remove French literature from his classroom. He refused to collaborate. On August 3, 1940, German soldiers came to the lycée, dragged Henri Beaumont into the street, and shot him in front of the students as an example of what happened to those who didn't cooperate. Elise was 24 years old. She watched her father's funeral, watched her mother collapse in grief, and made a decision. She was going to fight. She didn't know how yet. She didn't have weapons or training or connections. But she knew 2 things that most French people didn't. She spoke fluent German, and she understood how Germans thought. Those two things, she decided, were weapons. In October 1940, Elise and her mother fled Strasbourg, moving to Lyon in the unoccupied zone of France. Her mother found work as a translator. Elise found work as a maid, taking whatever job she could find, and she started looking for the resistance. It took her 4 months to make contact. The French resistance in 1940 was fragmented, disorganized, paranoid about infiltrators. But eventually, through careful conversations and trusted intermediaries, she met a resistance organizer who listened to her proposal. Let me work as a maid in German households. I speak German fluently. They'll talk in front of me because they think I'm just a servant. I can gather intelligence. The organizer was skeptical. You're a university student. You're educated. You'll stand out. Elise said, No, I'll be invisible. That's the point. They don't see servants. They don't think we matter. That's our advantage. In March 1941, Elise was placed as a maid in the household of a German logistics officer in Lyon. She worked there for 6 months, cleaning, cooking, and memorizing every conversation she overheard. She passed intelligence to her resistance contact. Troop movements, supply schedules, security weaknesses. The intelligence was good. It was actionable. And Elise proved that she could maintain her cover, that she could be invisible while gathering information that saved lives. In January 1943, she was given a new assignment: infiltrate the household of SS Sturmenführer Heinrich Vogel, a senior officer responsible for coordinating military logistics in the Lyon region. It was a high-value target. It was also extremely dangerous. If her cover was blown, she wouldn't just be arrested. She'd be tortured, interrogated, and executed. Elise took the job. She'd been working for Vogel for 8 months. And in that time, she'd become more than just an intelligence gatherer. She'd become a cell leader. The basement of Marie Dubois's dress shop was small, cramped, lit by a single electric bulb that flickered occasionally. It smelled like fabric and dust and the faint chemical scent of the dyes Marie used. 5 people sat around a wooden table that had been salvaged from a destroyed building. This was Amber Cell, Shadow Cell, named for what they were: invisible, dismissed, beneath notice. Elise sat at the head of the table. To her left was André Rousseau, 35 years old, a railway mechanic who worked at the Lyon train depot. He was broad-shouldered, with callous hands and a face that had seen too much. He'd lost his wife and daughter in a German bombing raid in 1940. He didn't talk about it. He just worked, fixed trains during the day, and sabotaged them at night when he could. Next to André was Marie Dubois, 29, the owner of the dress shop above them. She was elegant, well-dressed, the kind of woman who could move in social circles that included the wives of German officers. Those wives came to her shop, bought dresses, and gossiped. Marie listened, smiled, and remembered everything. She'd been passing intelligence to the resistance since 1941. Across from Marie sat Jean-Luc Martin, 42, a postal worker with graying hair and tired eyes. He'd been sorting mail for 20 years. Now he sorted German military correspondence, steaming open letters, reading them, resealing them, and passing the information to Elise. It was tedious, dangerous work. If he was caught, he'd be shot. He did it anyway because his son was a prisoner of war in Germany, and this was the only way to fight back. And finally, there was Sophie Laurent, 22, the youngest member of the cell. She was a university student who'd been forced to drop out when the Germans occupied Lyon. She'd found work as a typist at German military headquarters, typing reports, filing documents, and memorizing everything that crossed her desk. She was smart, quick, and absolutely fearless in a way that terrified Elise because fearless people made mistakes. But Sophie hadn't made any mistakes yet. These were the 5 members of Amber Cell: a maid, a mechanic, a seamstress, a postman, and a student. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And tonight, Elise was going to ask them to do something more dangerous than anything they'd attempted before. Elise laid out what she'd learned. Munitions train. September 13th, 0200 hours. 40 rail cars loaded with artillery shells, ammunition, explosives. Departing Lyon, heading east of the German border, then on to the Eastern Front. Andre leaned forward. Route. I don't have the exact route yet, but it'll go through the main rail line east out of Lyon. You'd know better than me. Andre nodded slowly. If it's a heavy munitions train, it'll take the southern route through St. Priest. The northern route has a steep grade, too much weight for a fully loaded train. Southern route is flatter, easier. Can we sabotage it? Elise asked. The room went quiet. They'd gathered intelligence before. They'd passed information to Allied contacts, to other resistance cells. But they'd never attempted direct sabotage. Never tried to destroy something this big. Marie said carefully. Elise, we're not saboteurs. We gather information. We're good at that. But destroying a train? That requires explosives, detonators, technical knowledge. We don't have any of that. Elise said, we have Andre. He knows trains, knows how they work, knows where they're vulnerable. Andre said, I can tell you how to derail a train, but derailing it isn't enough. A munitions train has 40 rail cars. Even if you derail the locomotive, the rest of the train might survive. You need to destroy the munitions themselves. That means explosives. Big explosives. And we don't have access to that. Sophie said quietly, I do. Everyone turned to look at her. She said, I work at military headquarters. I have access to supply requisition forms. I can forge a requisition for explosives. Say it's for bridge repair or construction. The Germans use civilian contractors for that kind of work all the time. If the paperwork looks legitimate, I can walk into a supply depot and requisition dynamite. Jean-Luc said, That's insane. If they catch you with forged documents, they'll execute you on the spot. Sophie looked at him, her young face calm. They'll execute all of us if they catch us doing any of this. At least this way, we're doing something that matters. Elise studied Sophie's face, saw the determination there, the anger. Sophie had lost her parents in the invasion. She had nothing left except this fight. Elise said, If we do this, we do it carefully. We plan every step. We don't take unnecessary risks. And if anyone wants out, say so now. No judgment. This is more dangerous than anything we've done before. Nobody spoke. Nobody left. Elise nodded. Then we're doing this. Andre, I need you to scout the route. Find the best place to sabotage the train. Sophie, you forge the requisition documents and get us explosives. Marie, Jean-Luc, you're on lookout and logistics. I'll continue gathering intelligence from Vogel's household. We have 4 days. Let's make them count. On September 11, 1943, at 10 o'clock in the morning, Sophie Laurent walked into a German engineering supply depot on the outskirts of Lyon. She was dressed professionally. Dark skirt, white blouse, her hair pinned up, carrying a leather briefcase that contained forged requisition documents she'd spent 2 days creating. She'd studied German military paperwork for months, knew the formats, the stamps, the signatures. She'd forged a requisition order from Oberschmidt, a senior engineering officer, requesting explosives for emergency bridge repair on Route D47. It was a real route. There was a real bridge. And Oberschmidt was a real officer who authorized these kinds of requisitions regularly. The forgery was perfect. Sophie had made sure of that. But perfect forgery still required perfect performance. She walked up to the supply desk, where a German sergeant sat reviewing paperwork. She placed her requisition form on the desk and said in fluent German, Requisition for bridge repair materials. Authorization from Oberschmidt. I need 10 kilograms of dynamite, 20 detonators, and 50 meters of fused wire. The sergeant picked up the form, read it slowly, too slowly. Sophie kept her face neutral, professional, slightly impatient like someone who had a job to do and didn't appreciate delays. The sergeant looked up at her. This requisition is for today. Why wasn't it submitted earlier? Sophie said, her voice calm, because a bridge damage was discovered yesterday during a routine inspection. The repair needs to be completed immediately before the route is compromised. If you'd like to call Oberschmidt to confirm, please do. But I should mention that he's in a meeting with the regional commander, and he doesn't appreciate being interrupted for routine supply requests. The sergeant hesitated. Sophie could see him calculating. If he approved a fraudulent requisition, he'd be in trouble. But if he delayed a legitimate requisition and angered a senior officer, he'd be in worse trouble. The calculus of fear and bureaucracy. Sophie waited, her heart pounding, her face showing nothing. The sergeant stamped the requisition form. Approved. Warehouse 3, Bay 7. Showed this to the supply clerk. Sophie took the form, nodded professionally, and walked toward Warehouse 3. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She walked like someone who belonged there, who had every right to be requisitioning explosives. Inside Warehouse 3, she presented the stamped form to the supply clerk, who loaded 10 kilograms of dynamite, 20 detonators, and 50 meters of fused wire into a wooden crate marked construction materials. Sophie signed for materials using a fake name, picked up the crate, and walked out of the depot. She made it 2 blocks before her hands started shaking. She made it 4 blocks before she had to stop, put the crate down, and lean against a wall while her body processed the adrenaline and fear she'd been suppressing. She'd just walked into a German military depot and stolen enough explosives to destroy a train, using forged documents and a calm voice. She allowed herself 2 minutes to shake, to feel the fear. Then she picked up the crate and kept walking. She had a train to destroy. That same day, Andre and Jean-Luc were 15 kilometers outside Lyon, scouting the railway line near the village of St. Priest. Andre had been right about the route. Heavy munitions trains used the southern line because of the flatter grade, and there was a perfect sabotage point, a curve in the tracks where the train would have to slow to 20 kilometers per hour. The curve was surrounded by forest, with minimal visibility from nearby roads. It was isolated, defensible, and perfect for what they needed to do. Andre knelt by the tracks, examining the rail bed, calculating. We placed the explosives here, under the tracks at the apex of the curve. When the locomotive passes over, the weight triggers the detonator. The explosion derails the locomotive and the first several cars. The derailment ruptures the munitions containers. Secondary explosions destroy the rest of the train. Jean-Luc said, "What about guards?" "The train will have guards. Minimal, according to Elise intelligence. Maybe a dozen. They'll be in the guard car at the rear of the train. When the locomotive derails, they'll be too far back to respond immediately. And once the munitions start exploding, they won't be able to get close. And us? How close will we be?" Andre looked at the forest surrounding the tracks. 200 meters. Far enough to avoid the initial blast. Close enough to confirm the sabotage worked. Jean-Luc nodded slowly. He was 42 years old, with a son in a German POW camp, and nothing left to lose. When do we do this? September 13th. 0200 hours. Same time the train departs Lyon. They spent another hour scouting the area, identifying escape routes, checking for German patrols. The area was lightly patrolled. The Germans didn't expect resistance activity this far from the city. That was their mistake. On September 12th, Elise worked her normal shift at Sturmenführer Vogel's mansion. She served breakfast, cleaned the rooms, prepared lunch. At noon, Vogel had a meeting with 2 other officers in his study. Elise brought them coffee, set the tray on the desk, and stepped back against the wall. Invisible, Vogel was discussing the munitions train. Departure confirmed for 0200 hours tomorrow. The train will reach the German border by 0800, then proceed to the Eastern Front. Security is minimal, 12 guards, standard protocol. The French resistance in this region lacks the capability for direct action. They're intelligence gatherers, not saboteurs. One of the other officers said, "Are you certain?" There have been reports of increased resistance activity. Vogel waved his hand dismissively. Small-scale operations. Cutting telephone lines, minor sabotage. Nothing that threatens a major asset like this train. The French resistance is weak, disorganized, and frankly, not intelligent enough to plan something this complex. Elise refilled Vogel's coffee cup, her face blank. Inside, she was memorizing every word. Departure confirmed. 0200 hours. 12 guards. The Germans were confident, overconfident. They dismissed the resistance as weak and stupid. That dismissal was going to cost them 500 tons of munitions. Vogel's adjutant, a young lieutenant, looked at Elise and said something in German. Does she understand what we're saying? Vogel glanced at Elise, then back at the lieutenant. The maid? No, she doesn't speak German. I've tested her before. She's simple, obedient, harmless, useful for cleaning and cooking, nothing more. The adjutant said, You're certain? She's been in your household for 8 months. She has access to everything. Vogel laughed. She's a maid. She's invisible. Even if she did understand German, what would she do with the information? She has no contacts, no resources, no capability. She's nothing. Elise stood 3 feet away, understanding every word, her face showing nothing. She finished pouring the coffee, stepped back, hands folded, eyes down. Nothing. That's what he thought she was. That's what they all thought. And that's exactly why they were going to lose. She finished her shift at 6 o'clock, left the mansion, walked through the checkpoints, and met with Ambercell in the basement of Marie's dress shop. She told them what she'd learned. Departure confirmed. 0200 hours. 12 guards. They're not expecting any resistance activity. They think we're too weak to attempt anything. Andre said, Then we prove them wrong. We have the explosives. We have the location. We have the plan. Tomorrow night, we destroy that train. At midnight on September 13th, 1943, 5 members of Ambercell met at the edge of the forest near St. Priest, 15 kilometers outside Lyon. They were dressed in dark clothing, faces smudged with dirt to reduce visibility. Andre carried the wooden crate containing 10 kilograms of dynamite, 20 detonators, and 50 meters of fused wire. They had no weapons. They weren't fighters. They were saboteurs, and their weapon was explosives and knowledge. The night was dark, overcast, no moon. Perfect conditions. They moved through the forest quietly, carefully, until they reached the railway tracks at the curve. Andre checked his watch. 12:15. German patrol passed through 10 minutes ago. We have 90 minutes before the next patrol. Let's work. Andre and Jean-Luc knelt by the tracks and started digging. The rail bed was gravel and packed earth, easy to move with the tools they'd brought. They dug a cavity under the tracks, directly beneath the rails at the apex of the curve. It took 20 minutes. While they dug, Sophie and Marie kept watch, scanning the darkness for any sign of German patrols. Elise stood by the tracks, watching, listening, her heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment where they stopped being intelligence gatherers and became something more dangerous. Andre placed the dynamite in the cavity. 10 kilograms arranged in a configuration that would direct the blast upward into the tracks. He attached the detonators, connected them to a pressure trigger, a simple mechanical device that would activate when the locomotive's weight passed over it. Then he ran a backup fuse wire 50 meters into the forest in case the pressure trigger failed. At 12:50, the explosives were in place, armed, ready. Andre covered the cavity with gravel and dirt, making it invisible. Unless you knew exactly where to look, you'd never see it. They retreated into the forest, 200 meters from the tracks, and waited. Elise checked her watch. 1:15, 1:30, 1:45. The train was scheduled to depart Lyon at 0200 hours. It would take approximately 15 minutes to reach this location. At 1:50, Andre whispered, If the train was delayed, if the schedule changed, we'll know in the next 20 minutes. Elise said, It won't be delayed. Vogel confirmed the departure time yesterday. The Germans are punctual. The train will be here. At 1:58, they heard it, a distant rumble growing louder, the sound of a heavy train approaching. At 2:01, the locomotive's headlight appeared, a bright beam cutting through the darkness. The train was massive, the locomotive pulling 40 rail cars, each one loaded with munitions. It was moving slowly, maybe 30 kilometers per hour, slowing further as it approached the curve. Elise watched, barely breathing. The locomotive entered the curve, slowed to 20 kilometers per hour, exactly as Andre had predicted. The massive weight of the locomotive passed over the hidden explosives. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The detonation was massive, a blast of fire and sound that lit up the night. The tracks erupted, rails twisting into the air like ribbons. The locomotive lifted off the rails, tilted, and crashed sideways into the forest. The first 10 rail cars followed, derailing in sequence, slamming into each other, into the trees, metal screaming and tearing. Then the secondary explosions started. The derailment ruptured munitions containers. Artillery shells detonated. Ammunition cooked off. Explosives ignited. Each explosion triggered the next, a chain reaction that ripped through the entire train. 40 rail cars of munitions exploding in sequence, a rolling wave of fire and destruction that turned night into day. The blast wave hit Elise and the others even at 200 meters, a physical force that knocked them down, drove the air from their lungs. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a continuous roar of explosions that went on and on. Elise pressed herself flat against the ground, covered her head, felt the heat wash over her. The explosions continued for 3 minutes. 3 minutes of continuous detonations, of fire and shrapnel and destruction. When it finally stopped, when the last explosion faded, Elise lifted her head and looked. The train was gone. Not damaged, not derailed. Gone. 40 rail cars of munitions had been completely destroyed, reduced to twisted metal and fire. The forest around the tracks was burning, trees shattered, the ground cratered. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to recover. 500 tons of munitions, enough to supply German forces for weeks, had been erased in 3 minutes. Andre said, his voice shaking, "My God, it worked. It actually worked." Sophie was crying, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Marie was staring at the inferno, her expression stunned. Jean-Luc said quietly, "We need to go, now, before German forces respond." They ran, split up into pairs, moving to the forest in different directions, heading back to Lyon through separate routes. Behind them, the fire continued to burn, visible for kilometers, a beacon announcing that the French resistance was not weak, not disorganized, and definitely not incapable of direct action. At 8 o'clock on the morning of September 13th, Elise reported for work at Sturmbannführer Vogel's mansion, exactly as she did every morning. She was exhausted, her body aching from the blast wave, her ears still ringing from the explosions, but her face showed nothing. She was just a maid, arriving for another day of cleaning and cooking. The mansion was chaos. Vogel was in his study, screaming at subordinates over the telephone. Officers were running in and out, carrying reports, looking panicked. Elise put on her apron, started preparing breakfast, and listened. Vogel slammed down the telephone, turned to his adjutant. The entire train, destroyed. 500 tons of munitions. Nothing salvageable. How? How did this happen? The adjutant said, "Sabotage, sir." Explosives planted on the tracks. The train derailed and the munitions detonated. The explosion was visible from Lyon. Vogel said, "The French resistance. It has to be. But how? They don't have the capability for this. They don't have the explosives, the technical knowledge, the coordination." Another officer said, "Gestapo is investigating. They're conducting raids across Lyon, arresting anyone with suspected resistance connections." Vogel said, "I want everyone investigated. Everyone. Civilian workers, contractors, anyone with access to German facilities or information." The adjutant said, "That's thousands of people, sir, including household staff." Vogel paused, then shook his head. "Not household staff. My maid has been with me for 8 months. She's simple, obedient, completely harmless. She doesn't even understand German. I've tested her multiple times." He looked at Elise, who was setting breakfast on the table. "Isn't that right? You don't understand a word we're saying, do you?" Elise looked at him with a blank, slightly confused expression. She said in French, "Je ne comprends pas, monsieur." "I don't understand, sir." Vogel turned back to his adjutant. "See? Harmless. Focus the investigation on people who actually have the capability to plan and execute something like this, not servants." Elise served breakfast, poured coffee, and stepped back against the wall, invisible. Inside, she was screaming with triumph. She destroyed his train. She'd led the operation that had just cost the German military 500 tons of munitions. and he was standing 3 feet away, dismissing her as too simple to understand what he was saying. The irony was almost unbearable. Over the next 3 days, the Gestapo conducted massive raids across Lyon. Hundreds of people were arrested. Dozens were executed. The Gestapo was looking for the resistance cell that had destroyed the munitions train, and they were willing to torture and kill anyone who might have information. Ambercell stayed quiet, stayed invisible, maintained their covers. Elise continued working at Vogel's mansion. Andre continued working at the railway depot. Marie continued running her dress shop. Sophie continued working at military headquarters. They didn't meet. They didn't communicate. They waited for the Gestapo's fury to pass. On September 15th, Jean-Luc Martin was arrested at a random checkpoint. He wasn't carrying anything incriminating. He had no explosives, no weapons, no documents. But the Gestapo was arresting anyone who seemed nervous, anyone who fit a profile. Jean-Luc was a postal worker with access to German correspondence. That was enough. They took him to Gestapo headquarters. They tortured him for 3 days. They wanted names, locations, contacts. They wanted to know who had destroyed the munitions train. Jean-Luc told them nothing. He endured beatings, electric shocks, waterboarding. He screamed, he begged, he cried. But he didn't break. He didn't give them a single name. On September 18th, Jean-Luc Martin died under torture. The Gestapo dumped his body in the street as a warning. Ambercell learned about his death through resistance contacts. They met in the basement of Marie's dress shop, and they mourned. Jean-Luc had been 42 years old. He had a son in a German POW camp. He'd sorted mail and steamed open letters and passed intelligence that saved lives. And he died protecting them, refusing to betray his cell even under the worst torture the Gestapo could inflict. Elise said, her voice breaking, "He saved us. If he talked, we'd all be dead. He knew that, and he chose to die instead." Sophie said, "What do we do now? Do we stop? Do we disband?" Andre said, "If we stop, Jean-Luc died for nothing. If we disband, the Germans win. We keep going. We keep fighting. That's what Jean-Luc would want." Marie nodded. "We continue. We're more careful. We're smarter. But we don't stop." Elise looked at the 4 remaining members of Ambercell. They'd lost one of their own. They were being hunted by the Gestapo. They were exhausted, terrified, grieving, but they weren't stopping. Because that's what resistance meant. You kept going even when it was hopeless. You kept fighting even when you were losing. You kept resisting because the alternative was surrender. And surrender meant the people you loved had died for nothing. Over the next 11 months, Ambercell conducted 12 more sabotage operations. They destroyed supply depots, derailed trains, cut communication lines, gathered intelligence that was passed to Allied forces. They were careful, methodical, invisible, and they survived. In August 1944, Allied forces liberated Lyon. American and Free French troops entered the city, and the German occupation ended. Elise walked out of Vogel's mansion for the last time, took off her maid's uniform, and revealed her identity to the French military authorities. She told them everything. 8 months working as Vogel's maid, gathering intelligence, leading Ambercell, destroying the munitions train. The authorities were stunned. The invisible maid had been a resistance leader the entire time. Sturmbannführer Heinrich Vogel was arrested by French forces on August 25th, 1944. He was being held in a military prison, awaiting trial for war crimes. Elise requested permission to see him. The authorities granted it. She walked into the interrogation room, where Vogel was being held. He looked up, saw her, and his face showed confusion. You're my maid. What are you doing here?" Elise said in perfect German, "I'm not your maid, Sturmbannführer. I never was. My name is Elise Beaumont. I'm a member of the French resistance. I led the cell that destroyed your munitions train on September 13th, 1943. I gathered intelligence from your household for 8 months. Every conversation you had in front of me, every document you left on your desk, every piece of information you discussed because you thought I was too simple to understand. I memorized all of it, and I used it to fight you." Vogel stared at her, his face going pale. "You? But But you were just a maid. You were nothing. You didn't even understand German. Elise smiled, cold and hard. That's why you lost, Sturmbannführer. Because you thought people like me were nothing. You thought servants were invisible, beneath notice, too stupid to matter. That dismissal was your greatest weakness. Because while you ignored us, we were listening. We were planning. We were fighting. And we won. Vogel had no response. He just stared at her, the realization dawning that the woman who'd serve his dinner, who'd clean his rooms, who'd been invisible for 8 months, had been his enemy the entire time. Elise turned and walked out. She never saw him again. He was tried, convicted of war crimes, and executed in 1945. After the war, Elise Beaumont was awarded the Médaille de la Résistance and the Croix de Guerre for her service in the French resistance. Her story became known. The maid who'd led saboteurs, who destroyed a munitions train while serving dinner to Nazi officers. She was interviewed by journalists, celebrated as a hero, but Elise didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd survived when others hadn't. Jean-Luc had died under torture. André had been killed in 1944 during another sabotage operation. Of the original 5 members of Ambercell, only 3 survived the war: Elise, Marie, and Sophie. The cost of resistance was measured in lives lost, in friends who didn't come home, in the way to survival when so many others had died. Elise became a teacher after the war, fulfilling her father's dream. She taught literature at a lycée in Lyon, the same subject her father had taught before the Germans killed him. She taught for 30 years, retiring in 1975. She never married, never had children. Her students were her family. And every year, on September 18th, the anniversary of Jean-Luc's death, she visited his grave and left flowers. In 1983, a historian researching French resistance operations interviewed Elise, now 67 years old. He asked her what she wanted people to remember about the resistance. She thought for a long moment, then said, "I want people to remember that resistance wasn't just soldiers and spies. It was maids and mechanics and seamstresses and postmen and students. It was ordinary people who were dismissed as invisible, as beneath notice, as too simple to matter. But we mattered. We fought, and we won, not because we were stronger or better armed. We won because we refused to accept that being just a maid or just a worker meant we were powerless. Everyone has power. Everyone can resist. And the people you dismiss as invisible might be the ones who defeat you." Elise Beaumont died on March 12, 1998, at the age of 81, from heart failure. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people: former students, fellow resistance veterans, historians, government officials. Marie and Sophie were there, the 2 surviving members of Ambercell, now elderly women who'd lived full lives because they'd survived a war that had killed so many others. Sophie gave a eulogy. She stood in front of the church and said, "Elise taught me that invisibility is a weapon, that being dismissed is an advantage, that the people in power will always underestimate those they consider beneath them, and that underestimation is how you defeat them. She was just a maid. That's what they thought. But she was a leader, a fighter, a hero, and she proved that there's no such thing as just anything. Everyone matters. Everyone can fight, and everyone can win." Today, there's a memorial in Lyon in the place Belcourt honoring the French resistance. Among the names carved into stone is Jean-Luc Martin, postal worker, member of Ambercell, who died under torture without betraying his comrades. And there's a plaque that reads, "In memory of the invisible heroes of the French resistance, the maids who gathered intelligence, the mechanics who sabotaged trains, the seamstresses who had weapons, the postmen who intercepted correspondence, the students who forged documents. They were dismissed as ordinary, as insignificant, as beneath notice, but they were extraordinary. They were the resistance, and they were the reason we are free." Every year on September 13th, the anniversary of the munitions train Sabotage, a small ceremony is held at that memorial. Fewer people attend each year as the generation that lived through the war passes away. But some still come, some still remember, and they tell the story of Elise Beaumont, the maid who wasn't just a maid, who led for spies who sabotaged a munitions train and proved that the people you dismiss as invisible are often the most dangerous. Because they're listening, they're planning, they're fighting, and they're winning. One act of resistance at a time. One sabotage train at a time. One dismissed servant at a time. Until the occupation ends and freedom returns. That's the lesson of Elise Beaumont. That's the lesson of Ambercell. That's the lesson of every invisible hero who ever fought back against those who thought they were nothing. You're never nothing. You're never powerless. And you're never too ordinary to change the world. You just have to refuse to accept the dismissal. Refuse to accept the invisibility. And fight back with everything you have. Even if all you have is a maid's uniform and the ability to listen. Sometimes that's enough to win a war.